Our next speaker is Alex, and Alex, I do apologize. I'm going to do my best here. Alex Nowrasteh. Alex is the Director of Immigration Studies at the Cato Institute Center of Global Liberty and Prosperity. He's got many popular publications throughout the Wall Street Journal, the USA Today, and the Washington Post. He's peer-reviewed in the World Bank Economic Review and the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization and Public Choice. He's the co-author of the recently published book, Wretched Refuse, The Political Economy of Immigration Institutions, and also was a co-author of a 2014 release, Open Immigration, Yay and Nay. He is a native of Southern California, received his BA in Economics from George Mason, and his Master's of Science in Economic History from the London School of Economics. Welcome, please, Alex Nowrasteh. Hopefully I said that right, sir.
Good enough. Thank you. Thanks very much, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here today to speak with you all about this topic. I think to begin talking about immigration, what we need to do is understand what the current legal immigration system looks like in the United States. This is a highly simplified legal map of the path to get a green card. When a lot of our ancestors came to this country through Ellis Island, this type of system did not exist at all. Basically, to come to this country legally, to get a green card, you have to go through this type of process in order to get there. Now, there are other visas. This is the visa to become a farm worker in the United States for 10 months. These are the legal steps that you have to go through. And I can send these to you afterwards. Suffice it to say, virtually nobody who wants to become a farm worker is able to do it due to these regulations and restrictions. This is the other process to become a temporary worker on something like a farm worker, not a farm worker, but to work in a hotel in the United States for 10 months, the legal process. This is 2/3 of the steps for that. So let's dispense with the myth immediately that it's easy to immigrate to the United States legally. According to law professor Elizabeth Hall, who is at Rutgers University, the legal immigration system is second in complexity only to the income tax. This is the type of system that exists today, and why I think it is incumbent upon libertarians to make immigration liberalization an important cornerstone of their political movement and ideology. Now, there are a lot of arguments that we hear against immigration. I'm going to focus on a lot of those that I think are of particular importance to libertarians like us, which is that immigrants, a lot of people think they abuse a lot of welfare. Others think they don't assimilate culturally. Others think they cause a lot of crime and terrorism. And others think they're basically going to import the institutions of socialism from abroad. What I'm going to do is show consistently, step by step, why each one of these is wrong, and why, from a libertarian perspective, the consequences of legalizing immigration, expanding legal immigration, going back to the system that reigned in the United States prior to 1875, where anybody could come here lawfully in order to live and work and eventually become a citizen, should be the policy that we propose and push for. So on welfare, the simple data and evidence show that immigrants in the United States vastly underuse welfare programs compared to native-born Americans. Depending on how you measure, they use 20 to 40% less of current welfare programs than native-born Americans do. Part of the thing that we can do, I think, to make this better, I would like to abolish the entirety of the welfare state, of course, but there are some things that we can do to make it a little bit better than it currently is, at least when it comes to immigration. One of them would be to pass a law that says that immigrants don't have access to any welfare benefits at all until they become citizens. We can't discriminate against citizens, of course, in the law, but to pass a law that says that they can't get any kind of means-tested welfare benefits or other welfare benefits until they become citizens will do a lot to reduce this further. But on its surface, immigrants currently underuse welfare in the United States compared to native-born Americans. Secondly, cultural assimilation. This is the idea that immigrants today are not becoming Americans like they did in the past. They are not learning English. They aren't becoming sort of culturally assimilated, and that's just simply not true. According to all the measures that we have in terms of learning the English language, religiosity, that doesn't mean what religion you practice, but whether you do practice a religion. On the terms of religiosity, civic participation, such as voting, joining the military, family size, income, education, intermarriage with other racial and ethnic groups. Immigrants by the third generation, which is the grandkids of the immigrants themselves, are virtually indistinguishable from Americans who have been here longer on all of these levels and all of these measurements. More interestingly, when you dig down into surveys, they ask a lot of questions like, are you proud to be an American? Which is a really good measure, I think, of how much you like the United States. It's a really good measure of sort of patriotism. Citizen immigrants, those who are, of course, naturalized in the United States, are more likely to be very proud than native-born Americans, and a little bit less likely to be somewhat proud, but just as likely to be not very proud at all. You can see there's not really a difference here in terms of how proud they are to be an American, except they're definitely more likely to say that they are very proud to be an American. And that's because a lot of them realize, compared to their home countries, how good of a country the United States is. Terrorism. We just heard a wonderful talk about the war on terror and why the United States should not be involved in the war on terrorism anymore. Now, one of the things that we have to realize is the reason why this started, of course, is because of the 9/11 attacks. Now, when you take a look at the 9/11 attacks, which were carried out by 19 foreign-born individuals on U.S. soil, those attacks are responsible for the deaths of 2,979 people. However, of all foreign-born terrorism committed on U.S. soil since 1975, the 9/11 attacks account for about 99% of all those who have been killed in terrorist attacks committed by foreigners. The other ones are very, very small, very few attacks. The annual chance of being murdered in a terrorist attack committed by a foreign-born person is about 1 in 3.8 million per year. To put that in comparison, the chance of being murdered by just a normal homicide is about 1 in 20,000 per year. So while terrorism is, of course, real, and it's very real, of course, for the victims and their families, and we should have a lot of sympathy for them, the danger from terrorism is vastly overblown. It is a lot smaller than people realize. So it is not a good reason to close the border or to stop lawful immigration. On the issue of crime, this is one that I hear a lot. The idea that immigrants who are coming in are more likely to be criminals. They're going to violate the life, liberty, and private property of other people who are here, of native-born Americans and other foreigners, and that's a very good reason to want to close the border. However, the evidence just simply does not bear that out. Native-born Americans, this is nationwide estimate, native-born Americans have an incarceration rate of 1,595 per 100,000 native-born Americans. Illegal immigrants have an incarceration rate about 1,000 per 100,000 illegal immigrants, and legal immigrants is about 489 per 100,000. So the differences in incarceration rates are vast. Immigrants are much less likely to be criminals than native-born Americans are. Now, part of the problem is that's just an estimate. We actually don't have great data on illegal immigrants in prisons. However, one state counts all illegal immigrants and legal immigrants in their criminal justice system, and that is the great state of Texas, which is a wonderful state to study because it has the second highest population of illegal immigrants in the country. And what we see there is the same pattern. Illegal immigrants have a much lower criminal conviction rate than native-born Americans, and legal immigrants have the lowest. So they're not importing crime. The more immigrants that move into an area, because they have a lower crime rate than native-born Americans, that mechanically lowers the crime rate and the danger that anybody's going to be a particular victim because they're much less crime prone, but they're also adding more people to a local jurisdiction. Now, the issue that I'm most interested in, what I wrote my book about recently, is are immigrants going to import a lot of the terrible institutions from abroad? Immigrants tend to come from countries that are much less free than the United States. They have much bigger governments overseas, much more interventionist governments, in some cases larger welfare states, but in almost all cases, a government that has much more control over the economies of their countries. The United States, we don't have the free economy that we all wanted to, but it is relatively freer than in other places. So the question is, are immigrants from abroad going to bring in sort of a lot of these bad institutions, these bad ideas about growing the size of government and having a larger welfare state, about having more government intervention? So what I did was I just took a look at the relationship over time, the rough correlation between the stock of immigrants in the United States as a percentage of the population and federal expenditures as a percent of the economy. That's how much the federal government spends as a percent of the economy. And the correlations all go in the opposite direction. What that means is more immigration, lower growth in the size and scope of the federal government. And that goes back to the 1850s. It carries forward to today. How much of a big difference? So in the 45 years when immigration was virtually closed in the United States, from 1922 to 1967, the size of the federal government increased by 302%. From 1876 to 1921, when we had practically open borders, the size of the federal government doubled, increased by about 117%. From 1968 to 2013, when we've had a little bit more open immigration, the size of the federal government has only increased by about 9% in real terms. So the correlations are pretty clear here, that the more open an immigration system is in the United States, the much slower the growth is in the size of the federal government. And it's especially true in the modern times. Now, this is sort of an interesting theory. It's not what you usually hear about, right? When you hear Republicans talk about immigration, they think, oh, they're importing socialism. When you hear Democrats talk about immigration, they're like, yes, they're importing socialism. But these facts do not coincide with that at all. And why would this be the case? Why aren't they causing, why isn't more immigration correlated with a big growth in the size of the federal government? And I think the easy answer is that immigration kills unions. Unions are the strongest domestic interest group pushing and lobbying for a larger federal government, for larger welfare programs, for more labor market regulations, for more government control of the economy, for more interventions on every single side, on every portion of our lives. What we've seen historically is that as the federal government grows, unionization also grows along with it. And historically, the relationship between unionization and immigration is highly negative. It's about negative 0.9. So if you want to really slow the growth of the federal government in the United States, one of the great ways to do that is to undermine labor unions. And historically, the best way to do that is by liberalizing immigration, because immigrants are less likely to join labor unions. They don't want to join labor unions. When Americans try to organize into labor unions, immigrants are resistant to do it. And even so, by having more cultural diversity in the workforce, it's just harder to make unions work anyway. And this is a finding that goes back to the 19th century. You can read actually some very funny quotes by Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx, sort of early communists. And they were writing, they had sort of the question of what is the last country in the world that will ever adopt socialism in their sort of nonsense view of the world. But they thought the last country in the world to ever adopt socialism will be the United States. And it will be the United States not because of American culture favoring individualism or the Constitution or anything like that. Their theory was it would be the last country to adopt socialism because the working classes are so diverse due to immigration that they will never put aside their differences to form together a workers' movement to overthrow capitalism. And I hate to say this because I think Karl Marx is a terrible economist who got virtually everything wrong, but this is probably the only thing he got right empirically. So when it comes to the issue of immigration, we're talking to the New Jersey Libertarian Party. What is it that a state party can do if it gets into power that outside of the federal government, right? The federal government does have most of the control over immigration. This is not due to anything in the Constitution, of course. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives power to Congress. It gives no power to Congress to control immigration, of course. This was invented by the courts in the 1890s. But that's a power that the courts say it has, so the federal government exercises it. What can the state governments do about immigration? Well, there are a handful of things. One, state legislature and the governor can ask the federal Congress to pass HR 5174, which is the state-sponsored Visa Pilot Program Act of 2019. What this does is create a visa program that every state in the country will be able to control, mostly on its own, with some federal oversight, but mostly on its own, which means that a state like New Jersey could design its own visa program for whatever it thinks is appropriate. Under this program, this bill, which was introduced by Representative Curtis of Utah, New Jersey would get a total of 11,984 visas in the first year to allocate however it wants. It could give it to dreamers or illegal immigrants in the state. It could give it to future immigrants from abroad, to investors, or it could sell them to the highest bidder, whatever it wanted to do in this regard. Each year under this program, if New Jersey follows the rules, it gets 10% higher bump in the number of visas. So after 7 years, because it grows exponentially, the number of these visas will double about every 7 years if New Jersey follows the rules. So we have in just a handful of decades, if this law is passed, New Jersey would have its own visa program in the high tens to hundreds of thousands per year that it could hand out however it wished to whomever it wants, assuming it's mostly consistent with federal exclusions about criminals, national security threats, and people who are diseased. But that is a great way to put an enormous amount of power in the hands of the states to liberalize immigration should the states choose to. Another way is to deregulate occupational and other licenses, such as driver's licenses in the state of New Jersey. A lot of licenses, and it really depends on the type of license, have restrictions where they say that you have to be either a citizen or a lawful permanent resident in order to work in certain occupations. There should be no discrimination in state law based on nationality. So if you got rid of those, that would really help a lot of people in the state compete in a labor market on an equal playing field. Also, making sure that anybody can get a license, no matter where they're from or whether they're lawfully present, will really lower the transaction cost. Now, I mean, I think you should get rid of all licenses, right? That's the obvious thing to do. But if you can't do that, at least removing some of these barriers will help lower the costs of these licenses that they impose on New Jersey's economy. Another thing to be aware of and to oppose wherever possible is the system called EVerify. Now, EVerify is this proto-national ID system created by the federal government in the 1990s. What it does is it's intended to push illegal immigrants out of employment. And the way it works is if you go and get a job, get hired at a location, when you fill out your I-9 form, which is this piece of paper that the government requires you to fill out that says that you're lawfully present in the United States, you provide a copy of ID. We thank Ronald Reagan for this in 1986, making this law. You're supposed to provide that form when you get hired to show that you're not an illegal immigrant. So what you're supposed to do is if you sign up for EVerify, if you're a business signed up for it, and in a lot of places it's voluntary, but not all, then you enter the information from that I-9 form into this government database online, and then the government tells you whether that person can legally work or not in the United States. And under the law, if it says that this person's not legally allowed, there's an appeals process and all this nonsense that takes hundreds of days. But you're basically supposed to fire them. Now, in New Jersey, EVerify is not mandatory. Some states it's mandatory, like Arizona. In Arizona, every new hire and every business has to be run through EVerify by state law in Arizona. That's not the case in New Jersey yet, but a lot of contractors in New Jersey, state contractors and others, do have to use this program. And a lot of local governments do require that hires for the local government or through local contractors have to use EVerify. Now, one step would be that if there's any government agency in New Jersey that requires EVerify, cancel that. Say, no, you don't have to use EVerify. Pass a law that says that state governments cannot use EVerify in the state. Now, I don't think you should restrict private businesses in using this stupid program. Right? I mean, I struggle with this as a libertarian sometimes. Like, should there be a rule against state businesses in a state using a federal program to enforce immigration laws? That's kind of a hard one to wrap your head around. I don't think there should be a law against it, but it should not be encouraged in any way. And any local governments that use it should be stopped by the state from doing so. Another thing, of course, which I think is the last thing and the most important and salient issue right now, currently, is that New Jersey should end all participation in federal immigration enforcement programs on the state level. This is basically cooperation with federal programs to hand over illegal immigrants who have been arrested on the state level. This includes canceling the 287G participation. That is the case in several counties in New Jersey. Now, I think you can make some obvious exceptions for this. People who are convicted of homicide or other serious crimes, fine, turn them over. But people who get pulled over for a traffic violation and get arrested, people who have violated a nonviolent firearms offense or a drug offense or a prostitution offense or other things that where there's no victim, you should absolutely not be that person should not be turned over to federal law enforcement to be removed from the United States. And those are only some of the things that the states can do, but those are some of the big ones. So, I'm really interested in hearing what you all have to say. Please hit me with any questions that you've got.
Anyone here or online?
I have a question, Eve Brownstein. Well, not really a question, just something I need to point out. I'm a human resources professional, so for perspective. On EVerify, one of the ways that they trap you with EVerify is that once you start using EVerify at your company, you have to continue using it for every other person that you hire. So you don't have to start using EVerify, but once you start using EVerify, you have to keep using it. It's a bit of a thing, you know. You think you're doing something that'll make the paper processing much easier, and especially now that we've got all of these regulations about data privacy and making sure that people's information is protected. It's a lot easier if you're not collecting that information and having to store it, and that you only store the bare minimum. And so EVerify seems very attractive, but there's that kind of tricky thing that you can get into. So I just thought that would be an important point to make.
Very helpful. And if I could add something to that as well, because EVerify is, it's a complicated system like all of this stuff. It's supposed to make it impossible to hire illegal immigrants, was the goal of it. What's interesting is it doesn't even work. So there was the largest raid of a business in history in the United States was in 2019, and it was in Mississippi. Now, Mississippi has EVerify as a statewide law. Every employer has to use it for every new hire. They raided and they found about 600 illegal immigrants working at a series of meatpacking plants. And what it turns out is when you have EVerify, all it does is check the documents that you turn in. Now, there's a system that kind of tries to link it to photographs, but it doesn't work very well. It works differently. It's kind of a silly system. But all it checks is the ID you give them. So if I'm an illegal immigrant and I give them Eve's identity documents and she's a legal immigrant, it approves me to work because it approves her documents. So what it does is it incentivizes identity theft. And it incentivizes another thing called identity loans. So what you see a lot of is a lot of people who have legal work authorization. Let's say they're older, they're retired, they're not working anymore, they move back to their home country. They give that to their family members who are illegal immigrants, or they give it to their friends, or they sell it for a lot of money so people can work. So what you have is the system of EVerify that incentivizes ID theft and other forms of law breaking. And what's even more hilarious is in places like Arizona, only about 70% of the new hires are even checked through EVerify when it has to be 100%. Why? Because the state doesn't enforce the rules. Now, why would the state, which doesn't try that hard, it tries a little bit, but doesn't try that hard to enforce other immigration laws, why would we be confident that it would then all of a sudden do a great job of enforcing employment laws on a local level? That would require shutting down thousands of small businesses generally in a state. So what EVerify does is it allows a politician to look tough and to say, yes, I want to enforce our immigration laws. But it's a tool that looks really good and looks effective to a lot of people, but it doesn't actually work. Now, the dangerous thing in my mind is if EVerify gets mandated nationwide, and a lot of Republicans are pushing for this all the time, to do it nationwide. So every hire and every business needs to be run through the system. What happens is like 5 or 10 years later, people are going to realize it's a joke and it doesn't work. And they've been sold a bill of goods. And then what are they going to do? They're going to push for another system to make it work better. And the only way to make EVerify work pretty well, not perfect, it could never work perfect, but to only make it work pretty well, a lot better, would be able to link EVerify to a biometric identity card for everybody. That's the only way to close that loop. And that's going to be the next thing they push for if EVerify becomes mandatory, because people are going to realize that EVerify, which is sold as a silver bullet program, everyone says it's going to work great, doesn't work at all. If it becomes mandatory, which it might, and when people realize it doesn't work, the next step is they're going to push for this thing to try to close the loop. And that is something that we should absolutely be opposed to, no matter what happens, national ID card, but we should absolutely be opposed to any stepping stone toward that. And EVerify is one of the most dangerous stepping stones toward that. Also, some Democrats on Capitol Hill have been talking about using EVerify as a check for when you want to legally purchase a firearm. So it's to get into there. So, and it's sort of a backdoor way to build a database of gun purchases because the current national instant gun background check system is deleted every 24 hours to try to make it impossible to build a database. EVerify records are not deleted every 24 hours. They're deleted usually every several years. So essentially, EVerify is a great way, not only, well, it's not a great way to enforce immigration laws, but it is a stepping stone to enforcing all types of laws that we should all be very worried about.
Any questions in the room?
I have a question online.
There's a question online. Go ahead.
Hey, Alex, thank you for your presentation. I'm very grateful for the stats and the numbers you have. I think a lot of the right-wing talking points about immigrants is that they're a monolith who vote one way and they're going to destroy your country and destroy your liberty. And as an immigrant, I find that to be utterly ridiculous. What do you think about this current populist right-wing notion that that immigrants are who work here in like H1Bs are being exploited by their employees? So it's like, you know, we're paying them less for less quality work. What do you think of that point, and how do you battle it when you're talking to right-wingers?
So a little bit of background, the H1B visa is a visa for temporary high-skilled workers in American firms. There are 85,000 available per year. Minimum wage to be employed is $60,000 on this visa. So we're talking about people who are fairly high skilled. The problem with the H1B is once you are on, a migrant is on that work visa, it's sponsored by the company, and it is fairly difficult to change jobs once you're on that visa for a firm. Like, it's not impossible, but you have to get government permission before you do it. And you have to have a new company available to hire you immediately. Otherwise, you become an illegal immigrant if you lose your job and you can be deported. So there are some, you know, so intuitively we'd think, okay, there's definitely some avenue for employers being mean to their employees on the H1B visa because they can't switch jobs as easily. So that natural check on an abusive employer is gone. Now, what's interesting is we don't see a whole lot of evidence of that when we take a look at the data. Wages for H1B workers are, you know, about the same or even a little bit higher than wages for native-born Americans who work and live in the same area because of that. So we don't really see the evidence of this exploitation. And what I would say to people who are really worried about this is, well, if you're worried about it, just make it easy for H1Bs to switch jobs, just like anybody else. Get rid of those rules. Allow them to switch an employer just like you or me or any other American citizen could do without asking the government for permission, without any negative legal consequences. The other way to also take a look at it is these workers get their visas voluntarily. They try to get them, extended. So it's a 6-year visa, one extension for 3 years, and then you get it extended again and again for green cards. So what I like to say to these folks is, like, one, show me the evidence. Just show me the evidence of that. And two, the answer to your complaints is deregulation. Deregulate the H1B visa. Furthermore, there's sort of a way to get from the H1B visa to a green card. It's just incredibly regulated. Very difficult legally to do so. A lot of rules that specifically actually discriminate against Indians. So the wait time for an Indian on H1B to get a green card, it depends on the visa, it depends on the green card, it depends on a lot of other things, but it's probably about 150 years wait time as far as we can estimate. And that's because the US government has green card rules that discriminate against immigrants from big countries. And India is a very big country. So we have these really, really stupid rules that do that. And so I think the answer all the way across this is deregulation, liberalization, increase the numbers, get rid of the numerical caps, and that will solve any problem, real or imagined, with the immigration system.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and we have it right here.
It seems that a lot of what you're saying is contradicting itself. On one hand, you're saying that we should liberalize and get rid of cap numbers, and then you're saying that we should hand it over to the states and give them a cap number. what's available, who makes that decision, what's available? Isn't it the marketplace that makes that decision? And if you're going to say to New Jersey, we're going to give you 15,000 visas, for instance, and we only have 13,000 jobs available, what's that going to do to the state labor costs? And if it's the reverse, if you get 15,000 and you need 19,000, can we go to Iowa and say, hey, we need to buy 4,000 of your visas?
Yeah, thanks. I agree. We shouldn't have numerical caps on this. I merely presented an option that will reduce and increase the number that are available currently for people to try to fill, right? So, I mean, I would like to get rid of all the visa caps. I would like to go to that right now. But like, just to put it in perspective, right now for green cards, there's about 1 million available per year. To make it a more open and more free market system, you could do a lot of things. You could get rid of the caps, which I support entirely, or you could increase the numbers by 50% or some other amount to make it a more open, liberal, free market system. You can choose which one you want to do. I support the more radical one, but the other one is also a step in the right direction. In the same sense that, I think that, there should be no restrictions on the private ownership of firearms. But if somebody proposed a law to get rid of 10% of the restrictions on privately owned firearms, I would support that too, because it's at least a movement in the right direction. So I agree with you. These rules and these laws that I've talked about are not nearly, don't go as far as I think they should, but they are steps in the right direction. So I think they're worth talking about.
Okay, thanks, Alice. I've been following your work for a long time. I just want to thank you for the work you do and all the writings you do with the Cato Institute and all the work you do. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for having me, and best of luck to you all.
Yep, no problem. Thanks.